All right. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Rose Spickler. I'm the Director of Statewide Engagement for Michigan Sustainable Business Forum, and I am pleased to welcome you to today's presentation of the Michigan Sustainable Business Forum Webinar Series. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, the forum is a collaboration of businesses and institutions dedicated to promoting practices that advance climate leadership, social justice, and the creation of a circular economy. We host events and programs throughout the state, including this monthly Michigan Sustainable Business Forum webinar series. Today, we're sponsored by Schupan with additional support from Foresight Management. For our next event, Michigan Sustainable Business Forum Great Lakes Bay will be hosting a sustainability happy hour on March 8th at 3 o'clock at Oracle Brewing in Saginaw. More details about that event can be found at MiSBF.org. Please do consider becoming a member of the forum. If you're already a corporate or institutional member of one of our regional programs, a professional MiSBF membership is complimentary. If not, you can become a professional member today for only $50. Now I'd like to introduce our program for today, Green Labs, creating a culture of sustainability in the lab. For our attendees, please note that you can share thoughts and questions with the panelists or all attendees through the chat function. We will have time at the end of the presentation for open questions and answers. Now I'd like to welcome our presenter for today, James Connolly, CEO of My Green Lab. James is a visionary sustainability executive with a track record of growing organizations that have transformed industries in multiple sectors, including manufacturing, real estate, tech, and life science. Over his career, he consulted with and developed sustainability programs for some of the world's largest companies and institutions. James is an internationally recognized corporate sustainability expert with deep knowledge of ESG reporting and strategy, and was selected as a Green Biz 30 Under 30 Sustainable Business Leader in 2017 and a Net Zero Energy Trailblazer in 2019. James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be joining you all today to talk about My Green Lab. So My Green Lab's mission is building a global culture of sustainability in science. And I think actually most people, and I didn't before I first got in touch with the founder of My Green Lab and got involved advising on organizational strategy, how much environmental impact comes from research laboratories. Laboratories are massively energy intensive spaces, 10 times more energy than office spaces, 4 times more water. They also produce a massive amount of plastic and other hazardous waste. Actually, up to 2%, a study in 2015 found that it was 2% of the global total of single-use plastic was just in research labs. We actually think that number might even be higher if you include clinical labs and other types of testing labs. So one of the things that I did when I first joined My Green Lab was dig deep into not only the energy intensity of individual lab buildings, but what is the overall impact of the industry more broadly. My Green Lab has actually partnered with the United Nations and the Global Climate Change Conference, COP, to produce a report on an annual basis measuring the carbon impact of biotech and pharma. And what we found was pretty surprising. And this was actually the first report to look across scope 1, which is the direct carbon emissions from fuel burned on site by company facilities or buildings, as well as the indirect carbon emissions from electricity purchased. And then scope 3, looking upstream at all the purchased goods and services, everything it takes to run an organization, as well as the downstream activities, everything that impacts everything that an organization produces and its impact downstream through its use. So looking across those 3 scopes of impact, we found that the biotech and pharmaceutical industry is actually has higher carbon emissions than either the semiconductor industry or the forestry and paper industry. And that's 2 industries that are traditionally thought of as major contributors to global climate change. We also came to a bit of a cheeky conclusion that biotech and pharma has nearly half the carbon output of the United Kingdom, this first study was released in 2021 when COP was in Glasgow. So it was really more just trying to root it in the time. And we repeated that study and released it at Sharm el Sheikh last year. And we found that actually the biotech and pharmaceutical industry's carbon emissions have increased. When we dig into the scope 3 emissions, what we found is that it's purchased goods and services and use of sold goods that dominate. So for biotech and pharma, about 4.3 times more carbon emissions comes from the value chain, scope 3 emissions, than scope 1 and 2, even though laboratory buildings are very energy intensive. And where they come within that is from purchased goods and services, and then the use of sold products. Purchased goods and services tends to dominate in a lot of industries, and I'm going to talk about why that's the case in biotech and pharma, and then how we're addressing it with our programs. So My Green Lab's programs are really designed very specifically to get at and drive carbon emissions within scope 1 and 2, within the buildings and the research laboratories that make up a large chunk of scope 1 and 2 emissions in biotech and pharma. We also then have tools to drive down the carbon emissions within the supply chain of this industry. So our ACT label is a certification for laboratory supplies, helping the first actually environmental certification for laboratory supplies. And then our My Green Lab certification can be applied to contract research. So there's quite a deep supply chain where you'll have, say, a big name company like Pfizer, AstraZeneca, they have their own research labs, but then there's a network of contract research organizations that support them, which fall into their scope 3 emissions. So we're really getting at key leverage points within scope 1 and 2, as well as scope 3. So to return to what we do, My Green Lab's mission is to build a global culture of sustainability and science to transform the industry into a global leader on environmental sustainability. Through education, community engagement, and market-leading certification tools, we are inspiring the scientific community to integrate sustainability into everything they do. Our vision is to ensure a world where all science is conducted in a way that benefits the health and well-being of people and our planet. Now let's take a little closer look at energy. Actually, over 57% of energy used in a lab can be impacted by the lab user. So this is a breakdown of energy consumption in a lab. The things that you can impact as a user in a lab are fans, lights, as well as plug loads. And that's really what our My Green Lab certification program does. It's an online self-assessment covering 14 different topic areas, over 175 questions. That's really about encouraging and motivating actions of lab members to be greener. It's about an 8 to 10 month certification journey from beginning to end. And it's quite a comprehensive program looking at energy, plug loads, water, purchasing, Vivaria, recycling, green chemistry, etc. So it's a really comprehensive approach to driving sustainable transformation in a lab. The way the certification process works is we, just like any continuous improvement process, we first assess a baseline. So we survey lab members to understand the current state of best practice. That takes between 3 and 5 weeks. We ask that there's over 50% participation, and then we make recommendations for improvement. Labs then have a period of time to implement those changes, and then they come back 6 to 8 months later for their certification. 50% participation is required, and we also make additional recommendations for certification at that second survey stage. Labs then have a period of time to make more changes, and we come back and we recertify every 2 years. Labs actually then receive a certification score, bronze being the lowest score, all the way up to green at the highest. Most labs will score in the silver and bronze range when they first consider certification, and they can get all the way up to green through implementation of sustainability actions. Getting to the green level requires not only behavior changes, but actually changes in the policies and procedures in a lab. So for example, one of the suggestions we have is chilling up your -80 freezers from -80 to -70. Doing so actually can reduce energy consumption by a third. But for most organizations, that's really a policy decision. So you have to get the whole organization involved in improving that decision. Here's just a sample of Green Lab certifications that we've done. Some of the best known biotech and pharmaceutical organizations, as well as some of the best known research institutes around the world, including Johns Hopkins, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. We've actually certified quite a number of labs. And due to this work with the UN that I mentioned previously, where we're quantifying the total carbon impact of biotech and pharma, my Green Lab certification was selected as a 2030 breakthrough outcome for the UN Race to Zero. If you're not familiar with the UN Race to Zero, it's a global campaign to get the world's organizations, all of the world's organizations, to be net zero carbon by 2050 or sooner. However, recently they've set up this Breakthrough Outcomes campaign, which isn't only looking at end goals, but what are more near-term immediate actions by 2030 that the industry needs to take in order to show progress on its pathway to zero carbon. So they've selected my Green Lab certification as that key indicator of success, and they've set a goal that 95% of labs across major pharma and medtech companies are My Green Lab certified at the highest level by 2030. That's pretty exciting. The way that the model for net zero transformation works for the UN is they first try to get enough organizations to commit to being zero carbon. That's what they call their breakthrough ambition. Then they select these intermediate tipping points, signals or key indicators that there's overall systems transformation underway. That's a breakthrough outcome. And then lastly, they're driving towards the ultimate sector-wide transformation, which is a true zero carbon world. And it's really interesting if you look at systems change and transformation on topics like zero carbon or otherwise, it's really not linear. Actually, as soon as the whole industry begins to shift, there's a cascading effect, and it begins to accelerate much faster. So our programs have grown dramatically over the past few years. We actually now have over 1,300 labs certified in nearly 40 countries, which is quite exciting. We're having a hard time keeping this specific chart up to date, and growth is really beginning to accelerate. One of the reasons growth is accelerating is not only does the program help achieve that breakthrough outcomes target by the UN, there's also significant return on investment for labs that participate. As a quick case study, in 2021, AstraZeneca invested around $60,000 in Green Lab certification for their R&D labs. By 2021, end of year, they had reported a calculated energy savings of $317,000 or 1,270,000 kilowatts a year. So that's a carbon savings of 900 tons and an ROI of 4.3. So there's real value in this process beyond just the recognition and getting the certification. We quickly learned as we were rolling out the Green Lab certification program around the world that you can't have a green lab without green products. So my Green Lab also worked to create the first environmental certification for laboratory products called ACT. ACT stands for Accountability, Consistency, and Transparency. And it's really like an eco-nutrition label for laboratory products. So we look at the manufacturing impact of products, the user impact, as well as end of life. And that totals up to an overall environmental impact factor score. Really sort of a quick snapshot about the environmental performance of a product. We have actually now over 2,500 labels. That program's growing quickly with more than 1,000 products in the pipeline, and it covers everything that you would purchase in a lab, from consumables to chemicals and reagents, and lastly, equipment. One of the things that My Green Lab is also working on is how we can drive more systemic change in the industry more broadly. So we've partnered with the International Institute for Sustainable Labs to launch a new campaign called the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science. With this campaign, what we're doing is we're encouraging the funders of scientific research to include sustainability in the suggestions and criteria that they're asking of the research labs that they fund. If you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit the website, sustainablescienceadvocates.org. It's a great program, a great opportunity for you to get your voice heard, to get ultimately who's driving scientific research, the funders of scientific research, on board with sustainability. So overall, My Green Lab has essentially an ecosystem of tools working to transform the industry. We first have our certifications, our My Green Lab certification, which is the international gold standard for laboratory sustainability best practice. We also have our ACT label, as I mentioned, which is the premier label for laboratory products. And then we also have advocacy and education programs. So we have a free program called the Freezer Challenge to encourage cold storage best practice. We have a My Green Lab Ambassador program, which is a global community of Green Lab enthusiasts. You guys can sign up for that. That's actually a free online program, as well as a global community of researchers that we gather together. We then also have a much more in-depth education program called the My Green Lab Accredited Professional. And it's really a deep program for people interested in lab sustainability to demonstrate their expertise, similar to a lead AP, if you're familiar with that, but focused on the scientific industry. And then lastly, we have these overall campaigns. We're a delivery partner for the UN Race to Zero, working to enable systemic transformation of the biotech and pharmaceutical sector. And this Million Advocates campaign, so UN Race to Zero is really focused on the private sector. How do we get companies and institutions in the private sector to adopt the Race to Zero, and then also achieve My Green Lab certification standards, which are part of the breakthrough outcomes, and then Million Advocates, which is really focused on transformation in the academic market. How do we get institutions and the funders of institutions to encourage sustainability in that sector? So our 10-year vision over the next decade is a complete transformation of the scientific community, so that every individual in science is fluent in sustainability and understands how they can make a difference through their work and actions, that every lab is green and every laboratory product is designed to minimize environmental impact through a transparent supply chain. We imagine a thriving culture of sustainability at every leading organization in science, and that the science industry moves from a laggard to a global leader on addressing sustainability. Want to leave you with just one last thought. That's one of my favorite quotes before we open it up for questions, which is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I'm excited to open it up now to your questions and answer any of your questions that you have about our organization and what we're trying to accomplish.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation. And as we have some questions come in from our audience, I have one of my own, but thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. If anyone wants to, or if anyone has any questions, excuse me, you can submit them in the chat or in the question and answer function in Zoom. So I'm curious, going forward, what do you see your biggest challenge being?
Yeah,
in the near future.
Yeah, I think for certification systems, particularly ones sort of that are like nascent and growing, often your early adopters are really committed. They're really excited. They have a lot of energy and enthusiasm, and they're doing the certification for the right reasons. As it begins to become more popular and actually start to become a requirement, as it is in the UN Race to Zero, you do have the potential for bad faith actors that just want the certification mark, but don't necessarily want to do the work. So that's really something that we're looking at how to address through adding additional rigor to the certification, adding additional layers of auditing to make sure that when somebody says they're a green lab, they've really implemented all the actions necessary. So I think one of our biggest challenges essentially is avoiding greenwashing by making sure that our program is really rigorous, that it's really driving impact, and that the people that say they're a green lab, it really means something. And so that's something that we're very focused on as an organization right now. We're actually going through a revision and update to both of our core certification programs to make sure that's true.
Wonderful, that makes sense. All right, do labs at universities typically seek certification independently, or do they tend to work with their sustainability departments or committees to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. So interestingly enough, most of the time, we get in contact with a lab just because there's an interested researcher, principal investigator that wants to make a difference. I think anybody who's worked in a lab knows there's a lot of environmental impact and would love to do something about it. And that's often how we'll start, just one lab or two labs at a university. And then it'll get noticed by the sustainability department and hopefully become a broader program. And we've actually seen a number of universities now create green lab positions that are specifically focused, sitting within the sustainability department, that are specifically focused on driving sustainability initiatives for their labs. So it does happen the other way sometimes. We'll be approached by a university sustainability director. However, it's quite powerful when it actually comes from the researchers and the scientists themselves. There's sort of wouldn't say it's a myth, but a perception in the industry that scientists are hard to engage with around issues of sustainability, because appropriately so, what they're really focused on is their research. But we have really a flexible process through this continuous improvement model that isn't going to impact the underlying research and hopefully actually helps support it and the integrity of the research. When it starts at sort of the sustainability office level, I think their concern is always, how are we going to get scientists engaged? It's great when it kind of comes from the other direction. But what I can say is, even when it starts in the sustainability department, we're really effective in getting those scientists interested, engaged. Our program is really designed for them, to support them to make sustainability changes.
What are the costs, and are there any cost offsets for certification, like tax credits?
Yeah, so the cost is $500 per lab if it's an academic lab, and $4,000 per lab if it's a commercial lab. So we give a significant discount to those academic labs. Right now, there's not any specific offsets or tax credits for My Green Lab certification, although we are talking to some utilities, in particular utility in the Boston-Cambridge area, to help drive down and provide incentives for labs that pursue our program. However, there's already sort of a built-in return on investment. We're seeing labs, even at that higher dollar cost of commercial labs, seeing significant ROI, which is exciting and quite powerful.
Wonderful. How often do you perform in-person audits at labs?
Yeah, so it's a great question. The program right now doesn't include an in-person audit. So we do a desk review of their certification responses, and then if something doesn't seem right, we ask for additional documentation. As I mentioned, that's kind of one of our central challenges, though, right now. That program works really well for engaged, excited laboratories that really want to be part of a climate solution. But as we scale up and more labs, some of them may be doing it because they have to, not because they want to. We're going to have to start adding in some level of audit and verification. And we're figuring that out right now in partnership with a group of technical committees that we've assembled to try to figure out how to have an audit, but keep it really low cost. Because I think that's one of the powers of the or one of the values of the program too, is that it's relatively inexpensive.
I'm curious that for the timeline of one of the, not necessarily in-person audit, but for the timeline for one lab to work with you for the certification, how does that kind of pan out?
Yeah, so typically a project will reach out to us, or a lab will reach out to us, or a group of labs within, the first couple months after we have a proposal signed. We can do the initial assessment. It takes at least 3 months from initial assessment before the lab can take its final certification assessment. Sometimes that can be longer. That could be 6 to 8 months for the lab to really implement changes. So it is that true continuous improvement process that we're looking at driving. And then at the end, so overall, the entire journey can be around 8 to 10 months from sort of initial contact to the lab receiving its certification. And I think that's important too. There's some other programs out there where the lab can just fill out one form once and then they're good to go. They get their certification mark, where we really want engagement and a process over time, which we think drives much more impact and much more lasting change within the lab itself.
Well, thank you for your diligence on that. That's nice to hear that it's not just a one and done. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Or James, do you have any closing remarks?
Yeah, just want to thank you for the opportunity to come and speak. If any of you are working with research labs, either academic or commercial labs, please do reach out. My email is just james@mygreenlab.org, and we'd love to support you. And see how we can help make a change within research labs. And it's quite interesting because biotech and pharma and big research universities are a lot of labs, but there's so many others. There's vet labs, there's fertility clinics, there's clinical labs, and all of them with a significant opportunity to reduce their environmental footprint. So if you're interested and you know a lab that's interested, please do reach out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for attending. If you found our talk valuable today, please consider becoming a member or checking out our website for upcoming webinars or other opportunities at MiSBF.org.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.